All right, that was very well done. Folks, what we're going to do is you're going to come and stand over here because we're going to do a feedback session. So if you all make your way to the Wall of Fame. And it's time for repeat back. So we will do this from group 1 all the way through. So each group, you can just give us this, an overview of our status quo. So group 1.
Okay, from an appointing party provision, we try to identify the challenges that are meeting us. So the first challenge for South Africa is the level of the digital adoption in the country generally across, and particularly in the industries we're dealing with. Operational challenges are out in the bush. It's very difficult to get anything electronically updated from Joburg or Pretoria while you're sitting somewhere in whatever. So that's a problem. Access to systems, network infrastructure, those sort of things are how we do that and how we would have to put that into the documentation. I'm not 100% sure, but it needs to be some part that it is achievable. Okay. Procurement requirements. We have some very specific South African procurement requirements. Whether that needs to be a separate item in the thing, but it is definitely a challenge as far as the country is concerned. CDE, having something environment. If you're going totally electronic, the guy standing 2 floors up in the middle of nowhere, and he hasn't got a network signal. It's really, really, really difficult to do stuff like that. So you end up going back to paper and everything else. Not necessarily a problem, but it is a problem if something happens on site and it doesn't get transferred back to the live model, which means there's going to be a break in whatever happens. I mean, in the process, it needs to be described that certain steps have to be followed. So that's really it. That goes along with the first to third world divide in the country itself. Part of that. And then the last tail end was something about client education. Obviously, if the industry moves forward, that one starts to fall away. But at the moment, it's a serious problem because the biggest client in the country is the government, and they need to be part of this, and we need to get them there. So that's part 1. Part 2.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So we were dealing with the invitation to tender, and just at the back end, the theme around the group was that we are looking at information. Whether it's digital, whether it's in what format, all we want to know is what are the current information management processes. So the status quo, I think the big outcome was that information or the information management processes in this step is not structured, not standardized, not consistent, and not even streamlined. And we had identified in terms of the type of activity providing information, we had summed to say we've got clients who don't even know how to craft what they want. So how do they get to a point where they can identify what information is linked to which activities? And the group had shared that there's this assumption by client that as consultants, you ought to know. So it's a big current practice, and it doesn't lead to better information being captured in this critical stage. There are no information management requirements. The entire group said certain disciplines will have more information, example, architects. So depending on the discipline, you might be privy to more information than other disciplines. And there's no method of scoping the level of information within these activities. And in terms of exchange requirements, again, there is a direct client to direct consultants and less exchange requirements between the consultants to consultants. No transparency. There's an upstream and downstream expectations where you need to figure your exchange requirements depending on which teams and so on. We have established that currently we can't say that there's any means to share or have a common reference to the resources that inform invitations to tender. And some examples there were that some information may be available in 2D or print formats in terms of reference data. There is no historic data archived. Even if it's archived, it's not structured properly. So all the information that informs the invitation to tender is not in the best method, even when consultants require information, or rather, There's usually RFIs so that consultants can respond better to the tenders because the invitation to tender has got so less information. And then in terms of evaluation methods, we've noted that it's usually very, very largely on price and preferential strategies and less on the information and the quality of the produce required. The fifth step, the invitation to tender. There's still a lot of hand delivery practice, and we know once it's printed, it is not in the best format. So the current practice in terms of invitation to tender has that big requirement. It's either in electronic format, and when we say electronic, it's largely PDF form, very static, or hand delivery type of requests within the invitations. And those invitations themselves may be in the form of design options submitted by the consulting teams, PDF, or presentations to the client bodies. All in all, we had said the information management process is lacking. Even when it does exist, it is in its poor format currently. Thank you.
Okay, so we were looking at step 3, which is tender response. I think there's probably some good news and some bad news. So the bad news is it appears it's a little bit like the Wild West when it comes to tender response in South Africa. The good news is that it's probably no different to most countries that I go to. So it's not that you're unique in that sense. But yeah, the conversation really, I think we took a little while to sort of to settle into where we were at. I think the main reason for that is that the requirements, obviously, as we've just covered in step 2, the invitation to tender tends to vary depending on whether it's a public sector procurement or whether it's private sector procurement. And also the approach through design or construction tends to vary quite a lot. So I think the main point here is that there doesn't appear to be any form of unified approach when it comes to preparing a tender response. I think in terms of the areas that we were looking at, I think there tends to be, obviously this is a generalization, but a lot of the tenders tend to be sort of checklist exercises where people are saying in the invitation to tender, you get 10 points for this, 10 points for that, and so on. And basically just people go through, and I suspect putting words into people's mouths, they just take the last one that they've done and then just populate that just to make sure that they get as many points as they can, and that's pretty much it, as opposed to trying to identify where they could actually add value or sort of innovate. I think we spent quite a lot of time in terms of the capability and capacity, which doesn't seem to be a sort of a general practice in South Africa in terms of making sure that you can do what you're being asked to do and what you've promised that you would do as part of the tender. Although we did suspect that generally that might have been done into other forms as opposed to explicitly for information management. It tends to be very CV led. So quite often organizations are told to submit the CV, the key personnel. But again, I think in my experience, what I found is that you have this A team. So, you put the top people's CVs into every job. And then it's actually the C, D, or E team actually turn up on site to do the job. I'm not suggesting that anyone will do that in the room, but so it's very CV led. I think the flip side of that is that those CVs go back to the clients, and I do often wonder how the hell they're looking at these CVs and making any sort of informed judgment about the capability capacity. What we've got is there's no, if you want to architect, if they're chartered, or if you want to engineer, it's relatively straightforward. We did talk about that in terms of the professional membership. When it comes to information management, we haven't got that. So obviously you've got the certification by Operam Academy, which is obviously globally recognized and will get you into any door. But generally, we haven't got any recognized. So it must be really difficult for the teams to do any sort of evaluation of that. So, but that tends to be how it is. There's a thing called the superintendents. I don't know if that's unique to South Africa. But we're talking around that in terms of I don't know, where's my friend? Do you want to explain?
To our industry and civils.
Okay.
Make sure the contractor puts the A team on when he said he would.
Yeah. Okay. So
it doesn't work.
okay. But the thought was there. It's a nice thought. Okay. So yeah. So clearly that's something trying to overcome this A and B team. The mobilization plan. So with any sort of gaps and the shortfall in the capability capacity, again, this doesn't seem to be any sort of informed practice. Although, again, it might be in other guises in terms of how you intend to be able to build a team, whether that's through partnership or bringing in any other consultants and so on, but nothing necessarily around dedicated around the management or production of information. There's a few other things around law and some of the regulations that you would have to comply with. Again, that tends to vary from different to country to country within Africa. It seems to be some sort of like, particularly on the public sector procurement, things that you have to have before you can sort of pass fail type sort of criteria in terms of tender response. Company grades, which I think we got something similar in the UK, but I think there was you were saying about this like 8 grades or whatever the grades were, and you have to be at least a certain grade organisation to even tender. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So there's a couple of sort of pass fails things as well. But as I say, generally there doesn't seem to be any consistency in terms of how it's done. Certainly within our group that we could point towards.
Okay, so we had to handle step 4, which is appointment. Okay, I'll be brief. Okay. Right, so a lot of this, what we had to discuss, basically how we're currently managing N4 at the appointment stage, right? And working as a BIM consultant as well, we found that managing this info most of the time, it's non-existent because of what happens before we get to step 4, right? So we get our consultants involved at a stage where they need to have an exchange information requirements. They need to have agreed on how to deliver the project, right? But that information doesn't pull through from the tender stages or from the client, right? So what we typically have had to do at appointment stage is develop a BIM execution plan from basically thin air, right? From nothing, from no information. And that's where most of the problem comes in, right? We agreed the type of information that's shared here is like a project brief that we typically get, and an appointment letter, which is a 1-pager, and everyone gets excited, getting ready to deliver an information model, right? But with no data. So generally for step 4, it is still a challenge. One of the guys here from, I won't mention names, right? They're still appointing using hard copies, right? And like you mentioned, that gets stashed somewhere else and the consultants move on with the project. But basically the bottom line here is on appointment stage, it's still very static. It's still very hard copy driven. And when we talk about a master information delivery plan or the TIDP as well, that's still getting managed on Excel sheets, right? And most of the time, once that gets set up, it gets stored in a common data environment somewhere and never gets revisited again because it's sitting on Excel. It's not a live document. So we sitting here with generally just handing over project, but there isn't really a delivery plan that gets discussed because it doesn't come from the tender stage, right? So to answer your question, the information is managed not digitally. It's very hard copy based, and there's on most projects, I could say there's a lack of digital or delivery plans that's handed over to the appointed parties. Okay.
Cheers.
Hi, everyone. So part 5 is mobilization. Short answer, we don't have anything like this. It's non-existent, doesn't exist. All right, so we had a bit of a discussion around it and how is it currently managed. Like I said, it doesn't exist in our current state. So in most cases, when we are appointed on projects and you're going ahead, we would have and this is companies that is now obviously trying to adopt this information management standard and going like, okay, no, we're going to have a kickoff meeting to get everybody on board. And explain what we're going to be using. No, we're going to use this CDE, we're going to use these products, and we're going to do that and do this and do that and carry on with the do's and that's. But there's no documented way of following a process. There's no documented way of following a workflow. A little bit of training. This is how you upload a drawing. This is how you download a drawing. This is how you sync a model. This is how you try and share it. And then it ends there. 6 months later, but why didn't you share the model? Sorry, I forgot how to do it. Okay, so that is definitely something that we need to look into as part of the, and maybe as part of an annexure as well, in the sense that mobilization is about making sure that what you've promised in here, I'm going to be delivering an animation model. Okay, is what you've promised here is that you've got the resources to actually do that. So if you don't have the resources to do this, you have the opportunity to go and actually get the resource, either train the resource or appoint someone to assist you with that. And understanding how that is going to work within the industry is going to make it a little bit easier. Right.
Thanks, Gary. So our stage was called the production of information. I'm just going to read quickly. The status quo in the country and within my group was a bit of a mixed bag. So in terms of information standards, drawings and models, we found that there's a lot of fragmented silo working. I think we all see that. In terms of reference information, in terms of scans and models, we definitely see the need for a system or multiple systems or portals for sharing reference information, purely because it leads to a lot of duplication of work, duplication of information. In terms of production of information, we still see it siloed. There's very little collaboration. There's very little input from ops and maintenance and facilities management into upfront planning. The one important bit was that the contractor is not included in the design phase, so much of the construction thinking is not built into how we deliver projects. The one bit is about the continuous update of manual information. So that's what it was a really great point and we see this daily on site where we see information being produced in one stage, moving through the process, but that information is duplicated multiple times. So that leads to great inefficiencies. There's one point about there's no standard way of federating models or information on projects. I think that's a great point because we've got information from contractors, consultants, engineers, maintenance staff, and none of that is federated into a source of truth. In terms of quality assurance, we see this as well. There's multiple quality assurance processes between the different disciplines on site, as well as in the design office. This is a great point. So it's all about the teams playing broken telephone because the quality processes are uncoordinated and not controlled. This was a cool point. So we're saying that the information for sharing, which is basically for construction, needs manual signatures of 2D drawings. So that basically means that we, as consultants or contractors, don't have a mechanism of officially signing off 3D information. So that for us is a problem. And the last bit about information models, in the country, We just don't have a process of managing information.
Thanks so much. I'm Logan. I must thank Zama and Holly for assisting our group. We lost a few number sevens, so it was a nice concentrated. So we focused on the information model acceptance. So there was a lot of context coming, I think, from us around the table. We started with, and I think there's a recognition, and we'll touch on it. It relies on the first 6 steps before this working, before we can get to that acceptance. So that's a critical point. And I think Paul did touch on it. This is not something that happens at the end of the process. It's part of the sequence of getting there. So we question the maturity level of how we manage. I think some of my operational experiences, our design information is very strong. A lot of what it takes to manage quality of delivery, the life cycle management of it, the ops and maintenance side, and possibly even end of life is often not clear. You know, it's not strong on that. So that can be a gap. Lack of initial screening with regard to that. So once again, relying on the processes, if they work well, that should be a clear screening point on that appointment of the relationship. And I don't think our processes are working strong enough where we're starting to exclude on the ability to provide the right information. I think there's definitely a lot of work happening in various industries, various bodies, but I think amalgamation of the models that come in there would definitely open source models. And I think that they touched on open source data of making this information accessible so we can remove that barrier in terms of people coming in and maybe being eligible for work, but obviously be able to deliver on quality items. And then I think if we recognize where we are as a country, where we are in terms of the environment, I think we refer to the procurement process, but I think that whole relationship and the timeline from starting in one and getting to the end can be protracted if we have to start and go again. So I think this could be seen as a hurdle, but I think it could be an enabler if we set it up correctly. Great, thank you.
Right, my colleagues from SANRAL, this one's for you. Closeout and asset information model. So I just started with one term over here, as-built, because that's really what it comes down to with us here in South Africa. It's either a file of paper or it's a CD or a USB drive with PDFs on it. And that will include anything from marked up drawings and red lines to commissioning data, certificates, warranties, whatever, what have you. And that'll be probably in a zipped file with some weird naming convention that no one can recognize. Then what invariably happens is in future, somebody's going to need something. Then they're going to phone up the consultant because the consultant's got the information because they've lost it. They've lost it not because they're negligent, but because the system doesn't work and because they have 5 different project managers or 10, and everyone's got a slightly different way of approaching it. This is not because they're bad people. This is because this is what happens when there is no system. O&M manuals and snags, when something breaks and now suddenly you can't find the information in time. All of that then feeds into this whole idea of operations, because the reason we create this asset information model is so that we can improve our operations. That's the whole premise. So when it comes to operational readiness, we're not doing a handover. In fact, if we look at the combination of CapEx and OpEx, and we've said this since the very first meeting of the BIM community, there isn't a handover of knowledge or a transfer between the folks who watch the thing getting built and spend the money on getting out of the ground and the poor people who need to make the thing work in the long run. Oftentimes there's another reason for this is there is no line item in our payment certificates for creating digital as-built. There's no line items for managing an information system, but that could be included over there. And so we could be specifying that. And if you start looking at the cost of putting this together, if you did it consistently throughout this whole process, it wouldn't be a huge line item. But there's stories of where this is an afterthought, and then suddenly it costs 10 times more than it should to try and recreate a useful set of data and an asset information model. So my colleagues in the road space, it's very hard to try and do this at the end if it wasn't conceived at the beginning. So that's an uphill battle. Folks, thanks very much. I think this is a really, really good snapshot, and well done to all of you. You got the brief 100%.